Geertje Schuitema. Okay, I'm gonna practice this, and I apologize for butchering it in advance.
No, don't worry.
She's an assistant professor at associate professor, sorry, at the Consumer Behavior and Technology Adoption at UCD's College of Business, and has done a fantastic amount of work on policies related to environmental behavior. So I'm going to give it to you directly, so you get to actually share your research with us as well.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So let me share my screen as well. Thanks so much for having me. I think it's been absolute fantastic session. I'm really sorry now I missed yesterday because it's been really good.
No. It's all been recorded, Geertje, so we will have recordings. We'll send them out to everyone if you get.
Oh, perfect. Yes, very good. So I think the panel discussion we started off, especially the second half, was really interesting, and because we already started tapping into public acceptance and how might we get people to accept more environmentally related policies, and that's what a lot of my work has been focused on. And what I want to do today is share a case study of you, but also I put it in perspective. And just to highlight, I think everybody will know this already, this picture illustrates really well, I think, what most politicians fear. If you were to implement a policy and you see hundreds of thousands of people in the street protesting against your policy, you know you have a problem, because there might be problems in the future implementing different policies. You have trouble implementing the policy they're protesting against. And in general, it's really a problem if you want to promote pro-environmental behavior, implement especially very coercive policies. This is something that as a policymaker and a government, you want to prevent happening. And this is also the reason why a lot of researchers focus on social acceptance, policy acceptance, because what we're really trying to understand is what triggers this behavior, and more importantly, under which conditions might people be willing to accept policies, even if it means that they have to change their behavior and it can be quite coercive. So a lot of research I've done is focusing on policy acceptance and understanding really the behavior of each of the individuals in a group like this. But just to put it into context, oh, this is really slow. Susan Beitel has listed 3 waves of research on policy and infrastructure acceptance, and I think she's really pinpointed sort of the research traditions in these 3 waves. So in the late 80s, you saw a lot of research on social acceptance focusing very much on the instrumental functions of public opposition. And the view was typically that individuals were ignorant, selfish, irrational. And the idea was we just have to convince them that these policies are the right thing to do. And NIMBY was introduced as an explanation for people to object to policies and infrastructure. It's very much focused on cost and benefits, are the drivers of social acceptance. Now, from the 2000s, NIMBYism particularly was very much criticized. So instead of focusing on people not interested in objecting to the cost in their own backyard or directly related to them, the idea is that there's actually a rationale behind a lack of social acceptance. Often people have a point. There is a reason why they object to certain policies, certain infrastructures, and it's not necessarily that they are against or resisting for the sake of resisting. Much more multi-stakeholder perspectives came into place, and social psychological explanations based on trust and justice were also much more covered in the literature. Then from the 10 years ago, this again was more criticized, and really the research was more deepened in the sense that they were more socially contextually embedded. So instead of just looking at acceptance and individual drivers, the context of certain groups, etc., was much more covered in the literature as well. Now, given that we're about 10 years down the line from this, I think we should consider whether we should start a new wave. And what I really think is missing at the moment, hang on, this thing is not working. What we're really missing at the moment in the literature is the fact that social acceptance is not a static concept. Social acceptance is something that's really dynamic. It can change over time, it can be influenced. And if you look at the literature so far about social acceptance, it's usually measured in a very static way. And what I'm interested in currently working on is thinking about ways, how can we measure and capture these dynamics? And if anybody has ideas of how to measure this, I'm really interested in discussing this as well. So social acceptance can change. And we've seen that primarily in the literature on transport policies, transport pricing policies, congestion charges. In Scandinavian studies, we've seen that the acceptance of transport policies can increase. So primarily I've done this study in Stockholm, but also we've seen similar effects in Gothenburg as well. The public acceptance of congestion charges can increase after people have positive experiences with this policy. So very often acceptance is low, very low before the implementation of a policy, but once, for miraculous reasons, sometimes the policy is implemented, you can see that acceptance can increase. But this is already indicating something. Very often policies are not implemented because right before the implementation, it may be stopped by a referendum, by public protests, etc. Now, in very few cases, there's also been policies that were implemented despite strong objections, but the acceptance never increased. In fact, they had to be abandoned after a certain period of time. For those who remember the 80s in Britain, there was this famous poll tax, which really caused riots and demonstrations. And I think city councils or parliament was even entered by protesters, where they had to abandon this poll tax and they reframed it at the end of the day. But one problem of this type of studies, I think, is very often the number of measure points. So if you just take 2 points in time where you compare the acceptance, then by definition, you will see it will either increase or decrease. And that's just given the fact you have 2 points in time where you measure. Now, an interesting study done in Groningen is they had various measurements point in policy acceptance, and what you see is that it fluctuates. So if you only have 2 points in time where you measure, yeah, you get an increase or decrease. But if you look at more points in time, you'll see that acceptance can really fluctuate. And I think this is something that's interesting to keep in mind, because at what point of time might you be able to then influence and change the acceptance, if you like. Now, as said, I'm trying to think about how can we measure and understand social acceptance better. And what I'll try to do today is present you a case study where I'm trying to put the survey study we did in a social historical context. And the argument I have is that I think most policies, environmental policies we're trying to implement, these are not new policies. These have a long history. And in this history, you can see that fluctuation in acceptance. It tends to go up and down, and people have thoughts about it. They're already biased in certain ways. They have experience with the political process around these policies. And I think if we don't take this historical context into account, we can never understand people's responses to a policy we're trying to implement today. So what I'm really trying to do is sort of illustrate this with a case study, and stop me if it goes on too long, because I can talk about this endlessly. So the case study I'm going to focus about is the Irish water charges. And the background to that story is I moved to Dublin in 2014, and the photo you saw on the very first slide was a picture taken at the time I moved, and I was wondering what on earth these people were doing in the streets of Dublin and what their protest was about. And it turned out the government was implementing a water tax. And me, naive citizen coming from Europe, could not understand why the Irish were not interested in paying for water, because it seems a civilized thing to do, and most Europeans do it. In fact, Ireland was exempt from the European laws on this. So I dug into the history of water charges and Irish paying for water, and this is a history, I won't go through all the details, from the day that Ireland got independent, about 100 years ago from England. And what you see on top of the graph is the major political events, and below that, the major events in terms of public resistance. And the thing to remember about this is water charges have been implemented 3 times before, starting from the 1960s. And they have also been abolished over these years 3 times. Basically, the cycle was as follows. The government was proposing the implementation of water charge, a water levy. Then there was always a lot of public protest, already organized sometimes in the 50s, where groups of citizens organized themselves and demonstrated, asked for boycotts, refused to pay. And then a political party would promise, in whatever elections were coming up, promise to abolish these charges. They would win the elections because it was a very hot topic in all of these elections, and they would keep their promise, so the water charges were abolished. So a new cycle in the policy change, someone would try to re-implement these water taxes. Again, huge protest, an election promise, and another abolishment. So that's sort of been the history, and that cycle's been repeated 3 times since the 1970s, really. So what happened in 2008 was the economic crisis, and Ireland needed to be bailed out. There was a huge loan from the European Union, and in return, the European Union demanded a lot of austerity measures. And as I said, Ireland was exempt from charging for water. And the European Union really demanded, as part of these austerity measures, that water taxes were going to be reinstalled. So the backdrop of the latest initiatives then to reinstall water taxes was this economic crisis, and money had to be paid back. It doesn't mean there were no environmental problems, because there was no water tax. It meant that the infrastructure was so bad that 40% of all clear water was leaking away. 25% of major cities did not meet the health and safety criteria. So there were really serious health dangers about the water quality at the time, and the infrastructure really, really needed the investment. So that's sort of the backdrop of this story. Then have a look at the numbers of the turnout of national demonstrations. As with any of these cycles, a national protest was organized in Ireland, and huge of people showed up, as you could see in that picture, and at its peak, just before the implementation, 150,000 people were reported to protest against water charges. So huge amount of people were showing up at these demonstrations. And have a look at the political debate that was there. The political motives were very strongly focusing on the budgetary shortfall, the austerity reasons, and there was very little focus in the debate at all on the need to invest in water services, water conservation, and health and safety issues. Interestingly, if you look at the details of this tax, everybody wanted to know, okay, how much are we supposed to pay? Only a month before the tax was really implemented, the details were released, and there was a lot of discussions about how much was supposed to be paid, who was exempt, what do we do with people with and without water meters. And because of the enormous amount of people attending these demonstrations, they even lowered the fees 1 month before the introduction of the actual charge. But there were also huge trust issues. There was a water bill that was rushed through Parliament, according to most media coverage. There was mismanagement in how authorities dealt with the tax and spent the revenues. And this was all against the backdrop of an economic crisis. On top of that, there was strong political divide. Half of the political parties were very much against this policy as well. Now, have a look at the number of people who actually paid the water tax, and we calculated it back on the revenues that were reported. And what you see is that at its peak, a year into the introduction of the bill, only 60% of people paid that tax, which meant that 40% of the households refused to pay a tax that's mandatory. I think this is quite telling, because there's strong resistance, even though the policy was implemented. And finally, have a look at these people. What we were seeing is you had these trust issues, but really, if you look at who is demonstrating, I think what you see are really clear emotions. What you see is old people in the street demonstrating against policies, and so what we try to do is combine all this information, the historical, the current debate, and sort of the observations we made. And we came up with what psychologists tend to do, is a model, which looks as simple as most psychological models would do, but it was designed with this context in mind. So what we propose is happening here, that the lack of trust in the government really steered emotions towards this policy, which are then, because it's difficult to articulate your emotions, which are translated into the perceived cost and benefits or the outcomes as a rationale of what might be used in the debate as arguments. And that in turn influences acceptance. So this survey, just to put it in context, was taken about half a year after the policy was implemented. And we measured these components in a survey, and by all means, we did not have a representative sample. We sampled staff members from 2 universities, highly educated, good income, lived in Dublin, fairly normally distributed political views. So just to stress, this is not a representative sample, but I think it is a sample of people who in principle would not necessarily be on the street protesting against these water charges. So in that sense, telling enough what we see in the results, I hope. So what we see in the results is that trust, to begin with, had an indirect effect on acceptance. There was no direct link to be found, but indirectly trust influenced acceptance. And so the less trust there was, you see there were more negative emotions towards the policy, there were more negative emotions and less positive emotions. So this lack of trust really influenced how people felt about the policies. The thing to say here is trust was measured independently of the measures towards the tax. Negative emotions then were the strongest predictor of acceptance. The stronger the negative emotions, the less taxes were accepted. And then negative emotions resulted in a perception that there were more costs and less benefits to be had of the tax. And if you look at this, you can also see that the emotions were much stronger predictors than the cost and benefits of acceptance. So lots of links and relationships to look at, but these are really the highlights and the key messages of what we found. So then we looked at, okay, we measured these emotions on these binary scales, and we linked them directly to acceptance, just to tease out which emotions then really determined acceptance. And anger and hostility were the main emotions that drove the lack of acceptance in this case. And if you look at the context, it makes sense, because lack of trust would really influence anger and hostility. And that explains the enormous attendance of demonstrations and the resistance towards the policies. I think it also explains the boycott of the tax quite well.
Just a quick note to maybe wrap up in like a minute or two. So we
yes, aftermath. So this is just a very quick end of the story. So that was basically what we found in this study. And then quite soon after the study, the whole cycle happened again. So there was an election coming up. There was a promise of one of the political parties to abolish the water tax. The new government was voted in with that promise. The tax was abolished. And on top of it all the taxes that had been paid were refunded to the Irish. So at the end of the day, there was no money coming in from the water tax at all. You can see that in the payment cycle. So as soon as the election was announced and the promises made, the number of people boycotting the tax increased and less people paid for it. So to round up, I think if you look at policy acceptance at here and now, what you see here, mismanagement, lack of leadership, lack of political support caused these negative emotions, and really tells you that explains why there was so much resistance. But also, if you look at the history, what you see is the repeated focus on the economic motivations of this policy, which was the case in the 80s, the 90s, and now again. And a lack of focus on the environmental and health reasons is really driving this debate as well. I think also really critical is this living memory. People understood from the past that they could boycott this policy, and as a result they had a powerful tool which had worked in the past, so why not do it again today? I think it explains why so many people boycotted, did not pay for this tax, and they used the history and their memory for that. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. I have a bunch of questions, but maybe I will hand over to Robert first to ask his question.
Hi, sorry I don't have my webcam on. I see it's a nice presentation. I see some similarities between this and the sort of agricultural policy in Ireland, where if you want, the emotions are the same sort of level. If you want for dairy and the herd size as they are for water charges. So how could we use the lessons learned from the water charges to try and promote a more sustainable agenda with regards to the size of the dairy herd and other pro-environmental agricultural policies? What's your thoughts on that?
So I think you're totally right. This pattern, you see it a lot in different policies in agriculture. I think you also see it in Ireland, where they're trying to build these transmission lines from the north and the south, and they run into a lot of community resistance. My main argument here would be is that for each of these cases that look similar at the moment, you have to look back at its history. What has the government done in the past that might trigger the emotions today? Or what did these organizations or industries do to trigger these emotions today? Because I don't think they are triggered only by current affairs. I think they're partly based in history. So even though there might be parallels, I think you have to trace it back to what happened in the past.
I think you're right, but I think every time the government has tried to do anything with it, it has always met the same resistance. Yes, it's a historical problem, but it still has to find a way to be solved. So I don't know if knowing the historical context in this sense, it stops the policy from going ahead to some extent just because of the risk of the backlash.
Well, if you look into the literature, there's different trust factors or categories. So you can have a lack of competence, but also lack of trust in their motivations, or related to, are they trying to do something for society or something for their own budget, for example? So if you look at all the different types of trust there are, or where a government might fail, then I think you would have much better, clearer indicators of where the government has to repair or focus on. And I think in case of the water charges, if I analyze it, they failed on every category, sorry to say. But I think that doesn't always have to be the case. So if it is about communication, or if it is about their motivations, that's something you might target as a government. So I think it can be narrowed down.
Great. I'm going to jump into Emma's question, and then this chat is like buzzing, but I'll leave it to Emma and then maybe pick up from the chat a bit.
Thanks, Ganga. Really interesting, Geertje. This is a topic that's always baffled me, our total resistance to water charges when everyone else in Europe has accepted them. But I wonder, did you look at, so, I mean, Ireland I always think is a bad context to kind of extend outside, so we seem to be resistant to everything. So I don't know if you looked at, like, we had bin charge protests, we had property tax protest, you know, we don't pay our TV license, many of us. So I wonder, like, do you have any feeling on, so a couple of people in the chat are saying about, you know, the timing of the water charges maybe was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. I wonder, was that the issue here, that the trust was, you know, just kind of at that tipping point? And if that was the case, I'm also just wondering, do you have any feeling on it? It seems to have just become a completely toxic issue now, so that even kind of whatever 6 years later, and in COP26, and we're all talking about climate action, and not a single party is mentioning the reintroduction of water charges or any attempt to kind of you know, invest in water in that way.
All right, so a couple of things. If I compare the response to the water tax, I think it's special. And partly because of that, if I see in the chat someone mentioning the plastic bag levy, which was really nearly popular and really exemplary in Ireland. So they're not always against all policies. But also the water tax is part of this anti-austerity austerity measures. Water tax was picked out. None of the other measures created this traction, this type of reactance. So I think in that case, the water taxes are more special because of its history. And the last thing to say is, I'm not sure if you're aware, but from the 1st of January, the government is proposing the implementation of a new version of this tax. So happy to talk to you about it, but we're gonna watch with a lot of interest.
Okay, maybe we just take a couple of questions here. I think you've addressed Susanna's point a bit about the plastic bag levy. Do you want to, I mean, something which came to my mind, which is a bit about I mean, Lorraine and Diane and I were also thinking about questions of fairness and the regressive nature of the tax. Was that part of the problem? Because, I think Heidi's mentioned the Gilets jaunes protests indirectly in terms of France, and often we have issues such as these goods are basic rights. So any thoughts on that? So should we even be intervening in these spaces in the first place, or just targeting the high polluters?
Yeah, so we measured fairness as well. What we saw, it's very strongly related to these trust issues, the lack of procedural fairness and the lack of trust together. But they were so highly correlated, it made no sense to include them both. But the procedural fairness was a major issue related to all the mismanagement, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay, fantastic. We're at 4 o'clock and I think we've kept time. I'm gonna have a request for you guys to put your videos on, just so we could take a photo and capture this moment. I really should have done this in the beginning, but I didn't. So it would be great for those of you who are comfortable to be able to do that. And then I'll take a quick snapshot just so that we have a memory of this for posterity. If you want to smile, that would be nice as well. Thanks very much. I see a bunch of cameras coming on, so thank you. Okay, 1, 2, 3, go. Thanks, guys. It's happened. Okay, you heard my screenshot. And we have a break now for 10 minutes. I just want to say a big thank you for everyone for the fantastic conversations that we've been having, for being active on the chat, for coming in the first place on a Friday afternoon. I can't actually think of a more pleasant way to spend a Friday afternoon, to be honest, but thanks very much. And I will see you guys in exactly 10 minutes. So at 4:10, we resume the last two presentations. Thanks everyone again for a fantastic discussion.